All right, so we're going to pick off where we left off. Again, the IPA debate has an affirmative, cross-examination, negative, cross-examination, affirmative, negative, affirmative. So what does this look like in an actual debate? Imagine the resolution, Mount Sac is expensive. And so that's the resolution. That would be the topic for the debate. And the affirmative is then going to argue that Mount Sac is expensive. Remember, the affirmative is the pro side. They have to support the resolution. Again, in academic debate, it's regardless if you believe it or not. You're going to say yes. And the negative debater is then going to say Mount Sac is not expensive. Once again, irrespective of their personal beliefs. In order for an academic debate to happen, we need to have one side on the pro side and one person on the negative side. So the debate will look a little bit like this. Hopefully this isn't overwhelming to anybody. I'll try to explain each one in order. And so in academic debates, we use a note-taking system called flowing. And what flowing tries to capture is the idea that each column is a speaker. So this first column is the first affirmative speech. The second column is then the first negative speech. The third column, the second affirmative speech. The fourth column, the second negative speech. And the third column will be the third affirmative speech. So each column represents a speaker. And then each row, going from left to right, represents a certain line of arguments. You'll notice I've tried to label these as affirmative issue 1, affirmative issue 2, negative issue 1, negative issue 2. And then as we proceed across the debate, as each speaker goes, they're going to write their responses to each particular issue directly to the right of the argument. And we'll kind of go through a debate to hopefully make this make more sense to you. And so imagine, again, we're debating Mount Sac is expensive. The affirmative debater would be arguing, yes, that's correct, Mount Sac is expensive. And they'd start off with an introduction, and then their first main issue is resolutional analysis. And I would say the only key word in here is probably the word expensive. What does that mean? And so I would say in this debate, expensive means to be unaffordable, that it simply is too expensive for a lot of people to attend. Then I would say something like, on affirmative issue 1, in academic debates we call that signposting, where you're telling us which issue you are in the debate. So I would signpost saying, on affirmative issue 1, my first reason Mount Sac is expensive is because of textbooks. For some classes, textbooks can cost many hundreds of dollars. And if you can't afford the textbook, then many students will not enroll in the class. And if you do enroll, but you're not able to afford the textbook, then students won't be successful. And so they'll drop out. My second affirmative issue 2, another reason why Mount Sac is expensive is that all the extra fees every student has to pay each semester for associated students, for the health fee, for parking, etc., etc., etc. And so with these two issues in mind, I would propose that you should agree Mount Sac is expensive. Now, in most academic debates, in IPDA debate, we then have a cross-examination period. The negative debater could ask maybe one question about affirmative issue 1, one question about affirmative issue 2. We would then move on to the first negative speech. Like I talked about, I would like you to start down here on negative issue 1, so that way we get an idea what you're going to argue in this debate. And so imagine the first negative issue is we compare costs to a 4-year school. And so again, as a negative, we're saying Mount Sac is not expensive, right? So I'm now arguing it's not expensive. And my first reason it's not expensive is compare Mount Sac to a 4-year. Compare it to Cal Poly Pomona. And while the tuition may seem a lot at, I think it's $46 a unit at Mount Sac, it's many hundreds of dollars a unit at Cal Poly Pomona. And so it's not as expensive as a 4-year university. My second negative issue why Mount Sac is not expensive is that you can get scholarships and financial aid. And so students enrolled at Mount Sac are able to get free money in the form of scholarships and financial aid to make their costs not as much. So those are presenting our negative issues. Remember, your second task in the first negative speech is to then go back and refute the affirmative issues. Why are these two arguments wrong? Why should the judge not be persuaded by the points the affirmative presented? So again, using 4-point refutation, I might say something like, now the affirmative issue 1 was that textbooks cost many hundreds of dollars. But I say there are OER options. OER stands for Open Educational Resources. Those are the online free textbooks. And I would explain my argument because therefore Mount SAC's not expensive. Then I would move on to the affirmative issue 2. The debater said extra fees each semester. And I could maybe, so they said there's extra fees each semester, but I say those are valuable. That while you may be spending a little bit of money each semester on fees, you're getting a great return for those. For example, you might be paying a little bit of money each month for the student, each semester for the student health center, but being able to go in and get health care at Mount SAC is way cheaper than having to buy it separately. So therefore, those fees are of value. It's not showing that it's too expensive. And then I would sit down. I'm done with my first negative speech. Again, there would be a cross-examination period in here. The affirmative debater can ask the negative debater some questions. Then the affirmative debater gets to get back up. And again, you can sort of view this like a tennis match. The affirmative hit the ball, the negative hits it back. Now it's the job for the affirmative to respond to what the negative debater just said. And so again, we start down here. We want to hear what your responses are to the negative issues. And so you'd say something like, on negative issue 1, my opponent said, well, let's compare it to a 4-year. And I might say, but I say, that's apples and oranges. We shouldn't compare a 2-year to a 4-year school. We're comparing different things. It's not fair. It might be like comparing to McDonald's to an expensive steakhouse. They're not the same, so it's not a good comparison. Don't view it through that lens. Next, on negative issue 2, my opponent said there's scholarships and financial aid, but I say not for everyone. And then I would explain that because only certain people get scholarships and financial aid, and not everybody can get it, so it's not a viable way to pay for college. Then I would go back and I would try to rebuild my first affirmative issue despite what the negative debater just said. And a good way to structure this is start with what you said on affirmative issue 1, tell us what your opponent just said, and then rebuild your argument. So I might say something like, on affirmative issue 1, I talked about the very expensive textbooks that make Mount SAC unaffordable. My opponent just said there are OER options, but I say not for most classes. While OER exists for some classes and it does provide a free textbook for students, there are many classes that don't have this option, especially for some of the most expensive textbooks, like in the sciences. Therefore, Mount SAC is expensive. Then I would go to my next issue. On affirmative issue 2, I originally told you how there's extra fees each semester. My opponent just said, but those are valuable. But I say, I disagree, it's a waste of money, and I'm forced to pay them. If I did find they were valuable and those fees maybe were optional and I could pay them, not pay them, depending on if I needed them. Maybe I already have health insurance through my parents, so I don't even use the Mount SAC Student Health Center. I don't need to be paying for this. Therefore, it makes it too expensive. Right? Again, 4-point refutation. So I have in my second affirmative speech, refuted negative issue 1, refuted negative issue 2, rebuilt my affirmative issue 1, and rebuilt my affirmative issue 2. All right, no cross-examination here. We just go right back to the negative side. Again, it's like a tennis match. You've hit the ball back over to the other side. Now it's my turn as the second negative. Remember, this is your last chance to debate as a negative, so you want to make sure you're making all of your strongest arguments. Again, you'd want to start down here. That's just the order the last 2 speakers have gone, so it's a little bit clearer for the judge. And again, a good way to structure this is start with your negative issue, tell us what your opponent just said, and then respond. So it might sound something like, on negative issue 1, I compared Mount SAC to a 4-year and showed that Mount SAC is much cheaper. My opponent said that's apples and oranges. We can't compare the 2 things. But I say it's lower division classes, so it's the same thing. If you take public speaking at Mount SAC or you take public speaking at Cal State Fullerton, you're getting the exact same class. You're just paying much less money. So it is the same thing. It's apples to apples. Therefore, Mount SAC is not expensive. Then on negative issue 2, I talked about scholarships and financial aid. My opponent said, well, not everybody gets this. But I say, but those who need it do get it. That the money goes to those who can afford college the least first. And so while it's true not everybody can get a scholarship, for those who have the greatest financial need, they're helped first. Therefore, Mount SAC is not expensive. Then I would go back up and I'd respond to the 2 affirmative issues one last time, trying to convince the judge not to vote for them. And again, I would go back to what you said in your previous speech. So you could say something like, on Affirmative Issue 1, I talked about OER options. My opponent said not for most classes, but I say more and more classes are offering OER options. And there's been sort of this shift where more and more professors are creating OER textbooks and are trying to adopt OER textbooks. And so the trend is going in the right direction. And even if some classes don't have them, most of them do, so it is not expensive for students. Finally, on Affirmative Issue 2, I talked about how those fees are valuable. My opponent said disagree, it's a waste of money, but I say it's still cheaper than off-campus. That if you are getting healthcare through your fee at Mount Sac, that's much cheaper than healthcare off-campus, even if you're getting it that way too. All right, now we go into the very last speech, the third affirmative speech, the last chance the affirmative debater has to try to convince the judge to vote for them. Again, just go in the same order, start with the negative issues, end with your 2 affirmative issues. Again, I would go back to what you said in your previous speech, and so I could say something like, on negative issue 1, I said we're comparing apples and oranges. We shouldn't compare 2-year and 4-year schools. My opponent just said, but lower division's the same. But I say an AA and a BA are not the same. That the degree you get at Mount Sac is not the degree you get at Cal State Fullerton. Therefore, we shouldn't be comparing these 2 schools. We should just be comparing community colleges with each other. Therefore, it is expensive. Next, on negative issue 2, I said not everyone can get scholarships. My opponent said, but those who need it can get it. But I say not all who need scholarships earn one anyway. Right? You might really need the money, but there's only so much available. Once that's exhausted, even people who need it may not get it. Therefore, it is expensive. Then go back up and finish by rebuilding my affirmative case. Again, on affirmative issue 1, I said not most classes have OER. My opponent said, but more and more do. But I say not most, so it's not an alternative to paying for textbook fees. Even if OER exists for some classes, a bunch of students are paying a lot of money for textbooks, therefore it's expensive. Lastly, on affirmative issue 2, I said it's a waste of money, you're forced to pay this. My opponent said, but it's still cheaper than off campus. But I say paying for something that you're not even using is a waste of money and makes it expensive. Phew, that's a lot to say. But hopefully that clarifies sort of what the debate looks like. Again, you're going to think about each column being a speaker, the first affirmative speech, the first negative speech, the second affirmative speech, the second negative speech, the third affirmative speech, and each row being a line of arguments. And then if you're a judge in the debate, you can look at this entire flow sheet and decide, who are you persuaded by? Were you persuaded by me, or were you persuaded by me in this sample? Just kidding. Were you persuaded by the affirmative debater, or were you persuaded by the negative debater? Again, this usually makes a lot more sense once you've actually done the debates. So if it's still a little bit confusing, feel free to rewatch this. We'll keep going over this. But as I've told students, as soon as you start actually debating, things get a lot clearer what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do them.